Recently, a Chinese university professor expressed growing pessimism about the future after discovering that several of his students born in the 1990s greatly admired Mao Zedong. This seemingly incomprehensible phenomenon made him question these students' intelligence. Usually carrying himself with professional dignity, the professor's words betrayed a sense of panic. He likely suffered severe psychological trauma during the Cultural Revolution, as even Mao's name makes him tremble, and seeing Mao's photo through a phone screen fills him with fear. In my opinion, putting aside everything else, it's quite undignified for a respected literature professor to publicly belittle his students' intelligence. His reaction also reveals a hint of arrogance from someone in a position of authority who considers himself more experienced. The professor seems to think these inexperienced minors shouldn't be fooled by propaganda, reminding them they don't even have voting rights yet. This rhetoric angered Mao's admirers. 40 years ago, such comments would have been enough to imprison the professor or even execute him without trial. In recent years, Mao Zedong has been gradually transitioning from an abstract figure to something more concrete. This once vivid person is being revived as a modern Chinese totem. Someone did a statistical analysis showing that sales of Mao's selected works have increased yearly since 2015, with 2020 sales doubling compared to 2019. Similarly, someone checked university library borrowing rankings. Unsurprisingly, Mao's selected works ranked first in 2020 across China's top 10 universities. Interestingly, Marx and Engels' complete works often ranked second. This trend isn't confined to schools. Among young people in general, reading Mao's selected works seems to be becoming a movement. It's not just students. Office workers consider it essential reading too. On subways, buses, on their way to and from work selling their labor, these New Age proletarians seriously study Mao's selected works. Their generational confusion finds refuge in this new spiritual resource. China is walking on dangerous ground. After China joined the WTO in 2001, coinciding with U.S. interest rate cuts, these two factors created massive international trade demand and boosted Chinese exports. China's industrial development became deeply integrated into international division of labor, paving the way for over 2 decades of rapid growth. Meanwhile, China's rise accelerated the hollowing out of U.S. industry and further financialized the American economic structure. Combined with the low interest rate cycle, U.S. asset prices soared and housing prices skyrocketed, setting the stage for the 2008 financial crisis. At that time, America wasn't just a beacon of democracy. After the Soviet collapse and the fall of communist mythology, it became the light of civilization. The neoliberal banner leading America forward became the dominant global ideology at the turn of the century. As a result, from the 90s into the new century, China's new generation of intellectuals widely criticized Mao's era and reflected on national character. Neoliberalism, wrapped in universal values, became fashionable in intellectual circles. Revolutionary terms from Mao's era like the people and collectivism became not just outdated, but harmful concepts that needed to be thrown into history's trash bin. Riding the wave of globalization, China gradually emerged from poverty. The market economy flourished, and society was filled with optimism. Young people enjoyed the benefits of the market economy. Then came 2008, when the global economic recession dealt a major blow to the free market. The U.S. asset bubble burst with interest rate hikes, financial crisis loomed over everyone, and neoliberalism's failure forced recession-hit nations to bring back Keynesianism, especially in China and the U.S. If Roosevelt's New Deal was Keynes 1.0, then post-2008 U.S.-China cooperation could be called Keynes 2.0. To address the crisis, the Federal Reserve launched 3 unprecedented rounds of quantitative easing, providing virtually unlimited liquidity, finally pulling the U.S. out of the quagmire after several years. However, the U.S. actions of providing income support to residents and injecting market liquidity carried potential inflation risks. Without enough cheap goods from the supply side to offset quantitative easing, it was like drinking poison to quench thirst. But with the U.S. in the process of deindustrialization, where would the industrial capacity to produce cheap goods come from? They could only count on rising China, and China heavily dependent on the existing trade system, couldn't refuse America's demands. With international demand plummeting, China showed signs of recession. Excess capacity worsened, and companies began laying off workers, leading to mass unemployment. In this desperate situation, saving America became saving China, a consensus among both countries' elite groups. Thus, a nutritionally complementary structure formed and deepened across the Pacific. The U.S. government fully played its role as the ultimate employer and lender of last resort, releasing massive amounts of money to make up for insufficient effective demand. Meanwhile, China launched stimulus plans and expanded industrial capacity to address potential unemployment waves. In this active-passive structure, China, in the passive position, had to continuously supply cheap goods to the active U.S. to prevent American inflation from threatening the entire international trade system stability. Chinese people constantly produced goods to sell worldwide for dollars, then used those dollars to buy U.S. Treasury bonds so America could implement quantitative easing, ensuring its residents and businesses had money to buy Chinese-made cheap goods. Anyone could see that, in this international cycle of commodity currency assets, China was essentially America's worker. And as the material production stabilizer for the Fed's quantitative easing, China's Keynesian practice would inevitably worsen excess capacity while expanding production and easing the crisis, setting the stage for an even bigger future crisis. By 2014, the debt investment-driven economic growth model finally hit a bottleneck, with problems like excess capacity and high debt gradually emerging. Despite targeted policies like supply-side reform and deleveraging, these measures didn't seem very effective. So the excess capacity problem could only continue to be solved by expanding capacity, and debt elimination became debt transfer. In the subsequent dramatic price increase and inventory reduction movement, household sector leverage ratios climbed along with housing prices. In contrast, new population growth decreased yearly, halving in 5 to 6 years. As Keynesianism's marginal benefits diminished and catalyzed by the pandemic, problems accumulated over many years could no longer be resolved, leading to the explosion of real estate and local hidden debt issues. China will be stuck in a long-term debt quagmire, and it's in this economic mini-cycle since 2015 that the new generation of young people facing setbacks rediscovered Mao's selected works. This background includes both internal and external movements of capitalism. On one side, China sits downstream from the U.S. in the international value chain. As the production end of the globalization system, China's vast workforce, through their maxed-out debt leverage, supports the entire system, including ordinary American citizens. Thus, America is viewed collectively as an exploiter, leading to strong anti-American sentiments among some Chinese middle-class groups and proletarians. This tendency clearly isn't just due to Chinese political propaganda. It's also a reflection of economic reality, albeit a one-sided one. The bankrupt haven't reflected on wrong economic decisions, but instead cover up mistakes with radical yet essentially conservative nationalism. For those unable to fully comprehend today's global capitalism, they believe the propaganda about America's imminent decline or collapse, China's great revival, and the liberation of Chinese workers. This logic unites a considerable portion of mainstream opinion under the nationalist banner, supporting the national rejuvenation narrative. However, national narratives can only cover up class conflicts, not resolve them. Since the establishment of the market economy, China has gone through multiple waves of wealth creation, leading to dramatic rich-poor division and profound social restructuring. Externally, through deep participation in international division of labor, China joined developed Western countries in building the post-Cold War globalization pattern. Through various actions after the 2008 financial crisis, it effectively became a supply-side pillar of the international capitalist system. Therefore, for today's Chinese youth, this production relationship that converges with developed countries is the fundamental internal cause of Mao's selected works' current popularity. But as mentioned earlier, this internal cause isn't just domestic. Looking at the bigger picture, China's development since joining the world in 1979 is also an internal cause of international pattern evolution, giving this internal cause a dual nature. So, as the main force of Chinese workers, young people oppose both external economic exploitation led by the US and internal unreasonable economic pressures like exploitative businesses and high housing prices. Regarding these two tendencies, Chinese youth have split into different groups. Interestingly, they might all be reading Mao's selected works, actively drawing resources from Mao's thoughts. China's modern new democracy actually withered just as it was sprouting, or perhaps democracy never really entered Chinese soil. The so-called revolution was just a rubber stamp. On Contradiction, Mao wrote that different qualities of contradictions can only be resolved by different quality methods. For example, the contradiction between proletariat and bourgeoisie is solved through socialist revolution. Simply put, seizing the wealthy's property. The contradiction between the masses and feudal system is solved through democratic revolution. Simply put, a voting mechanism, though people don't have votes. The contradiction between colony and colonizer is solved through national revolutionary war. Simply put, uniting everyone to fight against colonizers. Externally, the new democratic revolution aimed to overthrow colonial oppression. Simply put, defining democracy on their own terms, while internally it needed to overthrow both feudal system and bourgeois oppression. Simply put, redistributing power and wealth. Mao and the Chinese Revolution represent both radical change and national unity and stability. These dual meanings still exist in today's Chinese politics and society. In today's environment where liberalism is suppressed, left, center, and right all can use his name to express their positions. Whether China's far left, far right, or opposition, everyone likes to quote Mao's selected works to justify their positions. However, contradictions are both unified and opposing. Some read about class struggle, while others find inspiration about long-term China-US confrontation. Among 1,000 readers, there might truly be 1,000 different Maos. Students supported by their families versus young workers just discovering how hard it is to earn money. Though close in age, they've likely undergone a qualitative change in mindset. How could their views of Mao be the same? As different young people wax and wane, the meaning of Mao and his selected works also changes. 3 years, we've blinked through the pandemic checkpoint, but somehow the expected recovery hasn't materialized. Economic development has instead fallen under deeper shadows, with youth unemployment rate exceeding 20% last year. I think against this backdrop, sales of Mao's selected works will likely continue to climb. As current conditions persist, the renewed popularity of the Mao phenomenon signals rapidly worsening social contradictions. This point doesn't even need sales figures to prove it. It's already reflected in people's consciousness. On social media, channels promoting Mao's thoughts easily become viral. This is not a good sign. Since the new century began, Mao's image has gone through multiple transformations, demonized during the liberal trend, cynicized in the national narrative, and now facing another change. People are deliberately downplaying Mao's historical mistakes. Against the backdrop of global political polarization, attitudes toward Mao reflect changing tendencies among Chinese youth. Just like Stalin's improving image in Russia, liberalism and middle paths no longer hold appeal. Polarization is the future trend. To centrists, the ebb and flow between far left and far right will become the main historical current. However, China differs from Russia. After the Soviet Union's collapse, Russians discarded the communist fig leaf, so neither Stalin nor Lenin represented their country's legitimate foundation. But this isn't true for China. Will Mao ultimately be a generational legacy or historical burden in the future? I think people from different social classes, backgrounds, and positions will have different answers. Regardless, as the wheel of history rolls forward, let time once again prove the good and bad of Mao's thoughts in the soil of the new era.